People who work in the rural and informal economies remain vulnerable to social and economic exploitation. This is according to the latest report that's been released by the Bureau for Workers' Activities, which forms part of the United Nations International Labour Organization, the ILO. The study looked at workers' conditions across 15 countries in Africa, Asia, Europe and Latin America. To hear more about the research findings and get grips with the South African context, I'm joined by David Dokenu. He is the senior specialist on workers' activities at the International Labour Organization. His offices are based in Pretoria, the capital of South Africa. Good afternoon, David. Thank you very much for your time. Overview of the report first. What does it tell us about the conditions of rural workers across different parts of the globe, and what are the main trends?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I hope you can hear me very well.
Yes, we can.
Yes. The report published by the Bureau for Workers' Activity of the ILO emphasizes the fact that about 80% of the world poor live in rural areas. And these workers face severe decent work deficit, which relates to the poor health and safety environment that they work, low pay, excessive working hours, lack of stability and security in terms of the work that they do. And so these are some of the major challenges that has been identified by the report. And the report also goes on to make several recommendations in terms of how these challenges can be addressed within the context of the working environment in specific countries across the globe, but more prominently on the continent of Africa.
Now, just talking about the continent of Africa with the challenges, before we get to talk about how they can be addressed, I mean, there's different contexts. You have many people who work in agricultural farms, plantations. They are not even allowed to organize themselves into any labor group or join a trade union, for example, to fight for their rights. They are underpaid. You have women who are widows sometimes who are being driven out, and all sorts of challenges from their houses. And there are no alternatives, for example, and no benefits like pension fund.
Yes, you are absolutely correct. It is against this backdrop. That is why the Bureau for Workers' Activity has organized this particular studies to amplify and also bring to the fore the challenges that is confronting workers in the rural economy, and thereby made suggestions and recommendations in terms of how these challenges can be addressed. And some of the challenges that, how the way the report recommend, or the recommendation from the report, indicate that there's a need to strengthen what we call labor administration across the continent of Africa and the rest of the world, because labor administration has a crucial role in inspecting various workplaces, not only in the formal sector, but as well as in the rural setting. And the challenge that we have is that many of the labor administration personnel focus more on the formal sector rather than the rural areas. But there's a need for policy shift to encourage member countries to focus on labor inspection in the rural areas so that it can address some of these challenges that workers in the rural economy are facing.
In addition to policy shifts, what is the view of this research in terms of a recommendation for government's intervention? And does the private sector play a role?
Sure. Private sector has a role to play, but more prominently, it is the government that have a role to play, because the government provide the institutional and legal framework for labor inspection, for example. It is the government that has the responsibility to ensure that formalization of the informal economy, to ensure how informal economy operators who bear the brunt of this, how can these challenges be addressed through policy direction and institutions that government can set up that can go into the rural economy and begin to work with them and ensure that conditions of work can be improved in the rural economy. And then also ensure that there is also the need in terms of how do we integrate the rural economy sectors into the formal institutions. And this is also where we also believe that the informal, the private sector also has a role to play. That is, how do we integrate the rural economy into the national framework of the economy to ensure that rural workers have access to social protection, rural hours have access to labor inspection, rural hours have access to decent wages and living conditions, rural hours have protection against violations of their rights. And that is also the need to ensure how social dialogue can be integrated within the rural economy to ensure that there is voice for the voiceless within this sector as well.
Finally, and very briefly, if you may, sir, the child labor in the rural economy, it's another part of your finding that you've seen in terms of this report across these different jurisdictions, especially on our continent, including here in South Africa.
Yes, indeed, you are absolutely right. Child labor has become very prominent within the rural economy, especially with the advent of COVID. It has escalated. This is because many of the outgrowers in the informal economy are using their children at the time that schools have closed down and they're able to go to school. Many of them use their children to support them in the working environment and thereby denying these children opportunity for them to be able to have access to decent living as they go to school. It was also seen predominantly within the agricultural sector. That is also where there is predominant child labor. And so it is also important that policy, just about a couple of months ago, South Africa hosted a global child labor conference where in Africa, where the menace seems to be very pronounced, policies have been outlined, and the South African government has also outlined within the context of South Africa what they intend doing to be able to address these issues of children particularly engaged in hazardous work instead of going to school. So policy framework have been outlined to be able to help member countries to address these challenges of child labor so that children rather go to school, develop their potentials and their skills and become very useful citizens of the country instead of finding themselves in work and not going to school.
Thank you very much for your time, here on Today on ENCA. That was David Dokenu, who is a senior specialist on workers' activities at the International Labour Organization.